Hello everyone, this is Scarzig, and welcome back to the answer segment of my 1450 subscriber special. It was about a week ago that I uploaded that video, again just giving thanks for all the people who helped me get to where I am today, and I asked you guys to submit your questions for me to answer. I figured it'd be a fun little thing for you guys to kind of pick my brain a little bit. We have a handful of questions here. Of course, I wasn't expecting to get too many, but we do have some really good questions here, so it'll give me something to ramble on about. I really appreciate you guys stopping back through for part two. But anyway, let's jump right in. First question we have is, I'd be curious about your experience with other card games. Please talk about card games you play and or have played and what you think of them. The first card game that I really got into way back in the day was Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually, it was like the big craze, right? Back when, what Yu-Gi-Oh! Come out? 1997? Jesus, I'm old. But anyway, like, you know, when you're in school, there's always those fads, right? Like back before Yu-Gi-Oh, it was actually Pokemon cards, but I never actually played Pokemon. It was just more for the collecting sake. Yu-Gi-Oh was the game that I actually played and tried to get good at. I never played it at a competitive level. The struggle was real for me way back in the day. I unfortunately couldn't really afford to build like super top tier decks. I just did what I could with what I had, and I did have a lot of fun. Eventually, with the way the expansions were being released, and the fact that I wasn't really into the game terribly seriously, meant that I really didn't stick with it. I actually still have some of my old Yu-Gi-Oh cards, like collecting dust in a closet or something, but I haven't kept up with the metagame of it at all. I never ran into any ridiculous balance issues up until when they did the infamous like 13 banned cards list. That's when they like started limiting cards. There was like 13 cards that they just completely removed from the game, like Monster Reborn, Change of Heart, Yatagarasu, I remember, was pretty ridiculous. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there was a monster called Yatagarasu that when it attacked you, you didn't draw a card at the beginning of your turn. You skipped your draw. And so that meant that if your opponent caught you with a really, really shitty hand and then played Yatagarasu and attacked you with it, you couldn't draw any cards. So you were just stuck with basically no tools to develop or do anything. And it was called a Yata lock, and you just instantly lost because Yatagarasu in Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters all have rush, so you can attack as soon as you play them, and Yatagarasu returns to your hand at the end of the turn, so every turn they just play it over and over again, and they ended up taking that out. But that's the most probably bullshit thing I remember in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I encountered. The other game that I used to play, the other card game that I played very seriously before Duelist came out, was actually Might and Magic Duel of Champions. The game is no longer in development, I'm pretty sure, but you can still play it. It's on Steam still. And I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine about this game the other day. We were kind of just, going over what it did well, what it didn't do so well. And Might and Magic Duel of Champions is one of my favorite card games. I loved the system that they used. In that game, there was 4 lanes, and so you can, if your opponent plays a really big creature, you could just play something small in front of it to block it, or you could just develop power in the other lanes so that you could still pressure your opponent while they had a big dude trying to hit you. And there was like spells that affected certain lanes and certain rows. There was like front line and back line play and ranged minions that could only be played in the back line. Like there was all kinds of strategic depth there. And what I liked about that game was that you could, your hero that you picked had base stats that you could level up. And basically what you would do is if you picked a hero that had higher than normal base stats, because you needed to have like you could every turn increase one of your stats by 1, and cards, in addition to having a resource cost, like a mana cost, also you needed to have a minimum stat in order to summon it. So that was like an alternate curve that you had to work on the side, and you had to make sure that intersected with your mana curve. And so you could pick a hero that had higher than normal base stats so that you could get the minimum requirements to start playing the bigger stuff faster. And furthermore, in that game, you could forego increasing one of your stats to pay 1 mana and draw a card instead. So it was really easy to keep your hand up and still keep up with your opponent's pressure. So there was like this, do I want to just ramp up slowly in terms of stats and then start drawing cards? Or faster decks had the option to be closer to their optimal stat line for their deck and then start drawing cards so they could keep up pressure. So it was like really cool balancing that way. Heroes had access to different schools of magic. In Might and Magic Duel of Champions, all the spells were neutral, right? And so what you did is your hero could only use certain schools of magic. There was like fire, air, water, shadow, light, and earth, I think. And maybe one other that I'm forgetting. But, and then like depending on what combinations of schools of magic your hero had, you know, that would flavor your deck, because like fire spells were like dealt direct damage and like were AoE and stuff. Wind, I think, is the school of magic I was forgetting. They had like really cool like position altering effects and some lightning-y like storm effects that did damage. So I really liked that aspect, because if a hero got too strong, instead of nerfing the hero directly or nerfing the faction's minions that hero was using, you could just nerf maybe 1 or 2 of the spells. Like there was actually, it gave them a lot more levers for balancing. But that was the problem with that damn game, is that Might and Magic Duel of Champions had like terrible balance. This game came out before Hearthstone. This video is turning into a Might and Magic Duel of Champions review, but I really liked the game. I was very passionate about it. So when you like a game that much, you really get a sense for what problems it has, right? Because you know what needs to be fixed, and you hope that it does get fixed. Which is why, you know, I don't get mad when people, you know, start bitching about Duelist, because I'm salty as hell. Like if you follow me on Twitter, that's where I dump all my Duelist salt. But anyway, Might and Magic Duel of Champions came out before Hearthstone, I'm pretty sure. Or at least I want to say that it was like in the era of digital card games that behaved very, very similar to physical card games, and that your next set could just be like super duper power creeped, and you were like forcing people to buy it, right, in order to squeeze money out of them. Way back in the day, that was more acceptable, because it was basically agreed upon in a card game that the people who paid more money were able to get their hands on the most desired cards a lot more easier, and so you were just going to get your shit wrecked. But Might and Magic Duel of Champions, because it was a digital card game, right, you weren't, the rarity and scarcity of those cards wasn't real. Like when you play Magic the Gathering, rare cards are actually rare. There's less copies to go around. And so you're paying for a card with a strong effect, but you're also paying a premium because it's actually hard to find. In a digital card game, rarities are just to basically give you an inclination, right, to kind of clue you in that this card is really good and really strong and you should probably use it. And you know, it's also used to give you extra dust, right? Because you can make like a really crappy legendary, basically to say if anybody opens this, they can keep it if they want to build their collection, or they can disenchant it to get extra dust. And Hearthstone was the card game that introduced dust as a mechanic, as far as I'm aware, being able to break cards down into crafting material and then spend X amount of material to make cards per rarity. Might and Magic Duel of Champions sort of had that. They were called wild cards, where you would earn wild cards by opening packs. You would get them randomly in certain packs. It was like you got 1 or 2 per every X packs you opened, and like they had special bundles where like if you bought like a bunch of packs all at once, you got extra wild cards, and then you could convert your cards into wild cards, and you would get like 1 or 2 depending on the rarity. But the ratio they had of converting cards to wild cards and then getting the cards you needed was like super duper imbalanced. So you would need to trade in like a bunch of really rare cards just to get one good card that you needed for your deck. And it was really cash grabby like that, where it really incentivized players to shovel money into the game to get the cards that they wanted, especially from the new expansions, because you couldn't just cherry pick the cards you needed from an expansion in Might and Magic Duel of Champions. You had to already own X amount of cards from that expansion before you could begin to trade in wild cards for the rest of the cards you needed. So you already had to invest a certain amount. It was like really, really shitty, really exploitative the way they marketed their cards and the way they marketed their expansions. And the team didn't keep up with balancing the game very well. But the core system of Might and Magic Duel of Champions was actually like spot on beautiful. I would love to see somebody just take that game and reboot it. Like keep the same system and then just keep a better job of like monetization and you know, your balance. So that's really all I have to say about that. And then we're already 10 minutes in just from me ranting about that game. So moving on, what are some games that people will potentially see on the channel once you're able to put more time into YouTube, and or when the Darkest Dungeon playthrough is finished? Now, this is a really good question because I always have tons of games that I'm thinking about. Oh, it'd be so cool to put this on the channel. I'd really like to do that. Back in the day, it was a bit more loose. Like you can still look up my old Relic Hunter Zero videos. My old Lost Kingdoms playthrough, I actually stopped because my computer died. Same thing happened with my Castle in the Darkness playthrough. There was some kind of error with my recording software, and like all of the videos that I had pre-recorded like got corrupted, and I was like, damn. But anyway, those series weren't very popular, so I didn't lose out on much. But in regards to games that we would potentially see on the channel, there is a mod, actually a fan-made mod for Darkest Dungeon called the Pitch Black mod, which is it takes the base game because it's open source. That's what I really like about Darkest Dungeon. Like you can go in and you can edit values to tune the difficulty however you'd like, instead of just playing the base game. And so some fans got together and they made the Pitch Black mod where they switched abilities around. So like abilities do completely different things, have completely different damage and ratios, new enemy types. They wanted to make it even harder, new diseases, new trinkets, the whole nine. And so it's supposed to be like really legendary. If I feel like I'm on like a really professional like Darkest Dungeon level by the time I finish that playthrough, I think I would like to pick up on the Pitch Black mod. That might be a bit too much Darkest Dungeon, but I don't think you can get enough of that game, especially since the Pitch Black mod is so different. It would almost be like playing Darkest Dungeon 2, right? So I think that would be a really good idea. There's a new Wonder Boy game coming out for PC in a couple months. Wonder Boy in Monster World was one of the games I absolutely loved for the Sega Genesis, and I knew that it was part of a Japanese series. The Wonder Boy in Monster World is like Wonder Boy 4 in Japan or something like that. Like it had entries for the Super Nintendo and the NES, if I'm not mistaken, before that. But so maybe the new Wonder Boy game. Flint Hook just came out as well, and that seems like a really fun game. Darkest Dungeon, when I was looking through my Steam library, I noticed that I actually have a lot of roguelike titles kind of collecting dust in my my Steam library, and there are a few that perhaps are a bit more suited to being recorded, like The Binding of Isaac is probably a really good example. Enter the Gungeon is probably another really good example. Nuclear Throne is another. Like these really action-packed roguelikes, I think that make them a bit more fun to watch, as opposed to others that are actually like mystery dungeon style. That might be a bit hard to get through. Like Crypt of the Necrodancer is a really fun roguelike, but because it's combined with a rhythm game, you have to concentrate, and so there's no way I'd be able to play that game and commentate on it at the same time. So Pitch Black mod, or maybe some other roguelike, maybe Flint Hook or Wonder Boy are the titles I'm considering off the top of my head for a side game, and there's probably some others that I'm forgetting or that might come out in the meantime that I go, oh man, this game is absolutely perfect, I need to put it on my channel. So next question. Are there any anime that you like? And if so, what are some of them? My goodness, this is tough. I've seen a lot of series, and like I could list off the old classics like Cowboy Bebop, Samurai Champloo, like the ones everybody's seen that are generally accepted as good. So in regards to like a few recent series I've watched that I have really enjoyed that some people might not have seen is there's a series called Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon? That's the name of the show. And the title makes it sound like perverted weeaboo trash, right? Like you wouldn't want to watch something like that because people will just judge your soul. But it's a really good show with a really bad title. It's actually one of my favorite shows. It's about a kid who goes out to become a monster hunter and fight monsters in the dungeon. It's like he's like in this MMO style-y world, and you know, Sword Art Online comparisons aside, it's actually really good. I highly recommend it. I can't really describe. I just love when anime has the main protagonist that like starts off really weak but just has a super strong desire to get stronger and, you know, protect the people that he cares for, and that's what that anime really brings to the table. And it's just about his struggle to become stronger fighting all these monsters and stuff because he's like super weak at the start of the show. And that's one of the things I really enjoy too, is seeing a character like really come from nothing to become a badass. So Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon, Grimgar of Fantasy, and Ash is really stinking good. It basically takes that same formula of people in a fantasy game fighting monsters, but cranks it up to 11. It's basically like if you took Sword Art Online and then basically it's Dark Souls. The monsters are like really deadly, really strong, and the main party of characters, it's like a D&D party, have to fight these monsters because there's no other way to get income. They're like fighting and like trying to scrape together pocket change just to get by while putting their lives on the line constantly. And so they go into, you know, what it's like to live that kind of lifestyle where you could die at any moment. Like it's not like actual like magic healing is very limited. Like when the healing spells in that show don't they only seal your wound, but like you still suffer from like the blood loss of like actually taking such a devastating hit, and it doesn't like fully heal you. It just keeps you from like bleeding out. It lessens your wound. It's not just like a full cure to fill your HP. So even with a healer on their squad, you know, the fights are still really dangerous. And like the goblins that they have to go up against have swords and are really smart and cunning and are basically fighting for their lives. It's not just like a mindless enemy that's swinging a sword at you. Like they actually the enemies are using like strategic tactics and stuff against them. So it's really cool to see a more realistic take on that genre, and I really enjoyed it. A third one I suppose I would recommend here is it's called Six Braves of the Flowers, I think. I watch a lot of fantasy anime, if you haven't picked up on that. I love like swords and sorcery. And it's, check this out. So in ancient times, this group of chosen heroes fought like the Lord of the Demons or whatever, right? And then they sealed him. They couldn't defeat him fully, so they sealed him behind this magic barrier on a peninsula at the other side of the continent. And it's like every 100 years or 500 years or something like that, the barrier starts to deteriorate. And so a new party is chosen, assembled of the strongest fighters that happen to exist in the world at that time period, and they're all chosen. Like a special mark appears on their hand or whatever, and then they gather up and go to the peninsula. They have to re-defeat the demon lord and re-establish the barrier, right? And Here's the thing. There's only supposed to be 6 chosen heroes, but when all the heroes gather in at the at where the barrier site is to continue into the peninsula, that's where they all meet up. They show up and there's 7 of them. And so one of them is an imposter that is actually working for the demon lord, and they have to figure out which one of them is not a real chosen hero, and that's the show. And it's really cool, it's really good, and I enjoyed that. So look up those shows. Those that's your Scarzig anime recommendation for today. So next question: what kinds of music do you like listening to? Honestly, I'm just gonna link to my YouTube playlist that I get all my music from in the description, because it's like, I know it's super generic to say, oh, I listen to everything, but it's like so ridiculous that I'll just link you to it and you can see what kind of madness I listen to. It's mostly electronic. I suppose we can sum it up that way. It's mostly electronic. I've been really into synthwave lately, if that's even like, if that means anything to you. Like, it's like this super like thumpy 80s like Blade Runner aesthetic music. It's kind of hard to describe, but I've kind of been into that. I like orchestral music, like, you know, like Final Fantasy type stuff, I guess, like really grand scale orchestral music. I have a few tracks like that on there, and just anything weird that catches my fancy, and then maybe a few nostalgic tracks. But you can get a sampling there in that playlist. Again, I'll link it in the description. So next question: what field of work are you in? Long story short, I'm a handyman that doubles as a janitor for a retail store. There's a lot more like stuff that I'm in charge of that I could tell you about to kind of make myself seem like a bit more professional and kind of prop myself up a bit more. But at the end of the day, that's pretty much what it is. I clean stuff and I fix stuff. So yeah, that's it's a full-time job. It pays the bills, but I'd much rather be doing this instead. Next question: what is one of your favorite games that you don't think you'll ever play on the channel because you feel it would be boring to watch? That is a fantastic question. Let me see. The Lost Kingdoms playthrough I did, I kind of felt like it was boring to watch. It was very self-indulgent because that's a super nostalgic game for me. And I don't know if it didn't take off very well. And again, that was one of the first series that got killed by an old computer hard drive dying, so I couldn't really get too far into it to show off the really good stuff. But I think that one probably would be a bit boring. Another game that I really liked that I know would be absolutely horrendous to watch someone play is Gotcha Force. It's an old game for the GameCube. It's about like fighting robots, and each robot that you get, each Borg they're called, has different move sets and different powers and abilities and stuff, and you can customize your squad from like hundreds of Borgs they have to choose from in that game. But because the enemy AI is kind of lackluster, they just send like waves and waves of enemies at you rather than having like really strong AI, or they put you up against like a really big enemy or something like that. So it's not fun to watch, just simply because it's really tedious and repetitive most of the time, and it's kind of hectic, and the music is annoying, and it has a lot of stuff wrong with it for sure. But it is one of my favorite games. I love Gotcha Force, and it was one of those games that's on my list. I always wished that they would make a sequel to it. It's an old Capcom game, so if you're listening, Capcom, we still want Gotcha Force 2. The Gotcha Force fandom is out there, and we're still waiting. And so I think that's probably the worst choice if I were to play a game that would be super boring. In the early stages of my channel, I was thinking about doing a BioShock playthrough, actually. And I think at this point, it's kind of been done to death, and it might be sort of boring. to watch me play through it because, you know, everything's been spoiled and like psychoanalyzed because that game is so old and so acclaimed. Is there any other games that like I just said no, that would just be like way too boring to watch, but I really like? Risk of Rain might be a good example. It's a roguelike. It's like a roguelike 2D platformer shooter, and it's got a really good atmosphere. It's a very moody game, and you collect items that, you know, give you random powers and stuff. But the thing with Risk of Rain is that the longer you play, it scales up the difficulty. So not only do you need to play through randomly generated levels, you also need to try to be very quick to beat the game, right? To run through all of the levels. Because if you dilly-dally, if you say, oh, I don't want to complete this floor yet because I'm scavenging for treasure, then the difficulty starts to ramp up, and then enemies start spawning, and they deal more damage, and they have more HP. And so what ends up happening is that you're getting chased by like a giant horde of like these super tanky HP sink enemies, and so you're just kiting like these giant bullet sponges for like 20 minutes, because you can't just sneak your way past all the enemies and get to like the portal that leads to the next floor or the next level. You actually have to kill everything before you get a chance to before you get to leave the stage. And if you take too long, bosses start spawning and they're bullet sponges too. So I think that would end up being pretty boring. It was one of the games I initially considered, but I think that the potential for, again, these bullet sponge type enemies to just overwhelm you it would just make it really, really tedious. And so finally, we have, what video game character would you say has the best Rule 34? Now that is such an incriminating question. How dare you? How dare you ask me that? Let's not go into too much detail. Everybody has their preferences, but I think that everybody's been really appreciating that Android 2B from Nier Automata. I think everybody's been really enjoying that hype train, the fan art for that character, and we'll leave it at that, right? Everybody loves a good butt. And so thank you for submitting your questions, and I hope that you enjoyed getting to know me a little bit better, and hopefully we can do something like this in the future once I hit another really cool subscriber milestone. Since I uploaded part 1 asking you for these questions about a week ago, I've gone from 1,450 subscribers to now almost 1,500. So 50 subscribers, new subscribers in a week is really good growth for my channel, and I really appreciate it. Shout out to my new subscribers and my old ones. So feel free to leave comments on my videos. I'm always trying to get back at you guys. Look forward to more Duelist, more Shardbound, and more Darkest Dungeon in the meantime. I'll see you then. Have a good one.